In 1987, FBI Special Agent Richard Carter vanished from the face of the earth. He was last seen driving his standard-issue Ford sedan into the dense, mist-shrouded forests of rural Oregon, a sprawling wilderness that swallowed secrets whole. Carter, a sharp and ambitious agent from the Portland field office, had been investigating a string of unsettling disappearances along the remote highways crisscrossing the state's timberlands. Young men, drifters, tourists, they had all faded away without a trace, their cars sometimes found abandoned, their lives reduced to a missing persons poster tacked to a telephone pole. Carter believed a predator was at work, a ghost haunting the lonely roads, but his superiors were skeptical, leaning towards more mundane explanations. One damp October morning, Carter's own car was discovered parked near the turbulent, slate-gray waters of the Clackamas River. The driver's door was ajar, the keys still in ignition. An extensive search was launched. State police, local sheriff's deputies, and a small army of FBI agents combed the woods and dragged the river for weeks. They found nothing. No body, no weapon, no note. The official narrative slowly solidified into one of tragic misadventure. The prevailing theory, the one that offered the simplest, cleanest closure, was that Agent Carter, perhaps while scouting the riverbank for clues, had slipped on the slick, moss-covered rocks and been swept away by the unforgiving current. His body, they surmised, was likely snagged somewhere deep beneath the surface, lost forever to the cold, dark water. The investigation into the other disappearances stalled without its champion. The files grew thick with dead-end leads and unanswered questions before being relegated to a dusty shelf in a records room. The ghost of the Oregon highways remained a ghost, and the case of Richard Carter went cold, freezing into a cautionary tale told to new agents, a somber testament to the dangers of the job and the indifference of the wilderness. For his partner, Special Agent Marcus Thorne, it was a wound that never healed. The official explanation felt hollow, an ill-fitting suit for a man as meticulous and careful as Rich Carter. But with no evidence to the contrary, the case was closed, leaving Thorne with a silent, gnawing void that 4 years of other cases could not fill. But 4 years later, in the summer of 1991, in a forgotten corner of a sun-baked industrial park miles from the Clackamas River, a discovery was made that would shatter the quiet acceptance of the past. It would prove that Richard Carter had not been taken by the river, but by the very monster he had been hunting. Dale Evans considered himself a connoisseur of forgotten things. He was an auctioneer by trade, a man who made his living on the abandoned detritus of other people's lives. He navigated a world of padlocked storage units, repossessed furniture, and the quiet melancholy of lives packed away and left behind. On this particular sweltering August afternoon, he found himself at Secure Self-Storage, a tired-looking facility on the outskirts of Medford. The sun beat down on the rows of corrugated steel doors, turning the asphalt aisles into shimmering ribbons of heat. The auction was for unit number 113, its previous owner delinquent on payments for over 2 years. The lock was cut with a satisfying snap of bolt cutters, and the heavy door rolled up with a groan of protest, revealing a dark, musty interior. The small crowd of bidders, a motley crew of flea market vendors and professional scavengers, craned their necks. The contents were sparse. A few cardboard boxes sagging with age, a threadbare armchair leaking stuffing, and a heavy, olive-drab military footlocker tucked in the back corner. The bidding was brief and unenthusiastic. Dale won the lot for $35, a price that barely covered his gas. Later that day, back in the cluttered chaos of his own garage, Dale began sorting through his meager prize. The boxes contained old clothes, mostly moth-eaten, and a collection of chipped dishware. He was about to write the whole thing off as a loss when he turned his attention to the footlocker. It was heavy, solid steel, with faded stenciling on the lid. It wasn't locked, but the clasps were rusted tight. With a grunt of effort and the help of a crowbar, he pried it open. The air that escaped was stale, tinged with a faint, coppery scent that pricked at his nostrils. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like carefully folded fabric, lay a collection of objects that made the breath catch in Dale's throat. There was a Sig Sauer P226, its blued steel finish immaculate. Beside it, a leather wallet, And inside that, an identification card with a stern-looking man staring out from behind the lamination. Richard M. Carter, Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation. And beneath the wallet, resting on the folded material, was his badge, a gleaming shield of gold and enamel that seemed to absorb the dim light of the garage. Dale's hands trembled as he carefully lifted the items. The fabric underneath was a field jacket, dark green and stiff. He unfolded it. A massive dark brown stain saturated the chest and back, a gruesome map of a long-ago trauma. It was blood, old and dried, but unmistakably blood. For a moment, Dale just stood there, the silence of the garage pressing in on him. The mundane world of forgotten treasures and small-time profits had just collided with something terrifyingly real. He gently placed the items back in the locker, closed the lid, and walked on unsteady legs to the phone inside his house. He didn't call the local police. The badge, the gun, this was something else entirely. He looked up the number for the FBI's Portland field office. The voice that answered on the other end was professional, detached, until Dale, his own voice hoarse, began to describe what he had found in the old footlocker from Unit Number 113. A profound silence followed, a crackle of static on the line, before the agent on the other end spoke again, his tone now sharp, urgent, and stripped of all professional calm. The call reached Special Agent Marcus Thorne in his sterile office in Washington, D.C., a place of polished wood and hushed importance, where he now managed regional task forces. At 45, his dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples, and his face was a road map of long nights and difficult cases. The news from Oregon felt like a physical blow, an electrical jolt that arched across 4 years of carefully constructed scar tissue. Richard Carter. The name alone was enough to summon the ghost that had never truly left him. He listened, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the receiver, his mind racing back to the misty riverbank, to the hollow feeling of failure that had settled in his bones and never left. Within hours, he was on a flight, the sprawling geometry of the country passing unseen below him. He didn't want this case, yet he was the only one who could take it. It was his. It had always been his. Landing in Portland was like stepping back in time. The air was thick with the familiar scent of damp earth and pine, a smell he forever associated with the fruitless search for his friend. He was met by a young, clean-cut agent named Jennings, who drove him to the Medford police station where the contents of the footlocker were being held. The station was a small brick building, and inside, the fluorescent lights hummed with an irritating buzz. The evidence was laid out on a steel table in an examination room, each piece cataloged and sealed in a plastic bag. The gun, the wallet, the badge, the blood-caked jacket. It was like seeing relics from a dead man's tomb. Thorne stared at the items, a cold fury building in his chest. This wasn't the work of a river. This was an execution. Someone had killed his partner, stripped him of his identity, and packed his things away like a trophy. Then he saw it. In a small evidence bag of its own, separate from the rest, was a small object that didn't belong. It was a bird, no bigger than his thumb, carved from a single piece of light-colored wood. It was crudely but lovingly rendered, its wings slightly upswept as if in mid-flight. Thorne frowned, picking up the bag. "What's this?" he asked, his voice low. Jennings glanced at the tag. "Found it in the locker with the other items, sir. Tucked into a pocket of the jacket. We logged it as miscellaneous personal effect." Thorne shook his head slowly, a strange certainty taking root in his mind. "This wasn't riches," he said, more to himself than to Jennings. "I knew the man for 10 years. We came up through Quantico together. He wasn't artistic. He couldn't draw a straight line, let alone carve something like this. This tiny wooden bird was an anomaly, a single discordant note in the grim symphony of evidence. It was a mistake. The killer had left something of himself behind. For the first time in 4 years, the cold case had a flicker of heat. It was a small, fragile flame, but for Marcus Thorne, it was everything. He knew, with an instinct that transcended logic, that this tiny, insignificant-looking bird was the key that would unlock the truth of what happened to Richard Carter. Thorne's first stop was the secure self-storage facility. It looked even more forlorn in person, a place where things went to be forgotten. The manager, a weary man with a permanent squint, could offer little. The unit had been rented under the name John Smith, paid for in cash, in advance, for 5 years. The renter had left no forwarding address, no contact number. It was a dead end, designed to be won. Next, Thorne interviewed Dale Evans. The auctioneer was still shaken, recounting his discovery with a nervous energy. He described the locker's contents with perfect recall, but he'd seen no one, noticed nothing unusual. He was just a man who had stumbled into a nightmare. Thorne thanked him for his honesty and his courage in making the call, leaving the man to his garage full of other people's ghosts. With the preliminary interviews done, Thorne sequestered himself in a borrowed office at the local FBI annex and had the original 1987 case files sent over. The boxes were heavy with the weight of failure. He spent the next 2 days immersed in the past, the scent of old paper and stale ink filling the small room. He read every report, every witness statement, every transcript of every interview. He traced the lines on the maps detailing the search grid, the endless, overlapping circles in the forest and the river. He saw the photos of Carter's empty car, a lonely sentinel by the water's edge. And he read, with a growing sense of frustration, the reports filed by the lead local authority on the case, Sheriff Owen Blackwood of the Jackson County Sheriff's Department. The reports were meticulous, professional, and painted a clear picture of a cooperative and thorough local effort. On the third day, Thorne drove out to meet the man himself. The Sheriff's Department was housed in a more modern building than the Medford PD, a symbol of county pride. Sheriff Blackwood was a man who seemed carved from the Oregon landscape itself. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face, kind eyes, and a grip like a vice. He was still the sheriff, an institution in the county, re-elected 3 times without any serious opposition. He welcomed Thorne into his office, his expression one of deep, solemn concern. "Agent Thorne," Blackwood began, his voice a low, comforting baritone. "I was gutted when I heard the news." Truly, finding his effects like that after all this time, it reopens a lot of old wounds for this community. He leaned back in his leather chair, the picture of weary authority. "I remember the search for Agent Carter like it was yesterday. We had every man I had out there, walking shoulder to shoulder with your agents. We turned over every rock. I personally spent a week dragging that river myself. We all wanted to bring him home." Thorne listened, nodding slowly, watching the sheriff's face. The performance was flawless. The compassionate lawman, the respected public servant, the steadfast ally. But as Blackwood spoke, recounting the details of the search with practiced, sorrowful accuracy, a cold spot formed in Thorne's gut. It was too polished. Blackwood's grief felt recited. His sympathy, a well-worn coat he could slip on at a moment's notice. There was no hesitation, no fumbling for a forgotten detail. He remembered everything perfectly, a little too perfectly. "What was your take on Carter's own investigation, Sheriff?" Thorne asked, keeping his tone neutral. "The missing persons cases?" Blackwood sighed, shaking his head. "A string of tragedies. But Rich, Agent Carter, he was convinced it was one man, a serial predator. We looked into it, of course. We just couldn't find a link. The victims were too different, the locations too spread out. My professional opinion, then and now, was that it was a tragic coincidence of unrelated incidents. Runaways, accidents in the woods. This is a big, wild country. It has a way of claiming people." He was calmly, professionally, dismissing Carter's final, obsessive theory. He was dismissing the very reason Carter had been out there in the first place. Thorne felt the first real flicker of his intuition, the same gut feeling that had told him the wooden bird was important. He was sitting across from a man everyone trusted, a pillar of the community who had personally led the search for his missing partner. And every instinct in his body was screaming that the man was lying. Thorne left the sheriff's office with a manufactured smile and a deep-seated unease. Blackwood's dismissal of Carter's theory felt like a door being deliberately shut in his face. Back in his temporary office, he pushed aside the files on Carter's disappearance and pulled out the thick, neglected binders on the original cases, the missing hikers and travelers. He laid out the victim profiles on a large table, their smiling photos staring up at him, frozen in time before they vanished. A college student on a cross-country trip, a German tourist backpacking through the national forests, a young couple who had pulled off the highway to camp. The official investigation had treated them as separate incidents, islands of tragedy. But Carter hadn't seen them that way, and now neither did Thorne. He pinned a large map of southern Oregon to the wall and began to place red pins at the locations where each person was last seen or where their car was found. A pattern began to emerge, faint at first, then undeniable. All the disappearances had occurred within a 20-mile radius of a specific, desolate stretch of Highway 199, a lonely artery running through the Siskiyou National Forest. It was a road known for its winding turns and sparse traffic, a place where a car could be pulled over and no one would pass for an hour. A place that fell squarely within the jurisdiction of Sheriff Owen Blackwood's department. Carter had been right. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a hunting ground. The next day, Thorne drove to see the one person he had been dreading meeting, Eleanor Carter. She lived in a modest house in a quiet Portland suburb, the same house she had shared with Rich. The years had been kind to her physically, but her eyes held a permanent shadow of grief. She greeted him with a polite, brittle firmness. Their meeting was fraught with the ghosts of the past. He was the partner who had survived, the one who had come home. "They told me you were reopening the case," she said, her voice steady as she poured him a cup of coffee. "I always knew that river theory was wrong. Rich was too careful, too smart." Thorne gently explained the discovery in the storage locker, omitting the grislier details of the jacket. He needed something, anything she could remember, a detail that might have seemed insignificant at the time. He was obsessed with those missing kids, Marcus, she recalled, her gaze distant. He said everyone was looking at the details, but no one was looking at the space between them. He said the killer was hiding in that space. She paused, then stood up and walked to a small desk in the corner. He had his own set of notes, not official files, just his own thoughts. "I never gave them to the Bureau. They felt personal. I packed them away after." Her voice trailed off. She returned with a small, leather-bound notebook and handed it to Thorne. "Maybe there's something in here you can use. Something to finally find the man who did this." Thorne took the notebook, its worn leather cool against his palm. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with the last thoughts of his dead partner. It was a direct link, a voice from the grave, and he knew it held a power the official files never could. Thorne spent that night under the dim light of a desk lamp, carefully turning the fragile pages of Richard Carter's notebook. It was a chaotic mix of case details, personal reflections, and frantic, scribbled theories. Carter's handwriting, usually so precise, grew more agitated in the final entries, mirroring the urgency of his hunt. He saw his partner's mind at work, connecting dots no one else could see, chasing a phantom everyone else had dismissed. And then he found it, an entry dated just 2 days before his disappearance. "Blackwood patrols too clean. Knows the roads too well. Something hidden in the pines. Saw him parked on a fire road, miles from anywhere. Just sitting, watching." It was a seed of suspicion, a flicker of doubt Carter had harbored against the affable local sheriff. Thorne's heart hammered against his ribs. Rich had been onto him. He had seen something that made him wary of the man everyone else saw as an ally. Thorne kept reading, his focus absolute. A few pages later, a small, simple sketch in the margin caught his eye. It was rough, barely more than a doodle, but it was unmistakable, a small bird, wings upswept, carved from wood. Beneath it, Carter had written a single cryptic question, "Dashboard Saint." The pieces clicked into place with the force of a shotgun blast. The bird from the sketch. The bird from the storage locker. It was the killer's signature, a calling card he left for himself. Carter had seen it. He had seen the bird on the dashboard of a patrol car, Blackwood's patrol car, on that lonely fire road. He hadn't understood its significance then, but he had noted it down, his investigator's mind cataloging an anomaly. That must have been what sealed his fate. He must have confronted Blackwood or asked a question that was too close to the truth, And the sheriff, the hidden predator, realized the FBI agent was no longer just investigating missing hikers. He was investigating him. The motive was suddenly crystal clear. Carter wasn't a random victim. He was a threat that had to be eliminated. Armed with this earth-shattering connection, Thorne began a new, covert investigation. He no longer cared about the missing persons. He was hunting a murderer who wore a badge. He started with the storage facility. He pulled the payment records for unit number 113. John Smith had paid in cash for 5 years, but the rental agreement had been initiated via a mail-in form. The return address was a P.O. box in a neighboring town. A few discreet inquiries and a call to a trusted contact in the Postal Inspection Service revealed the box was registered to a shell corporation named Pine Ridge Holdings. It took Thorne another day of digging through Byzantine corporate registration databases, but he finally found the name of the sole proprietor of Pine Ridge Holdings. It was Owen Blackwood. The sheriff hadn't just been the lead investigator on Carter's disappearance. He had rented the very locker where his victims' effects were stored, a gruesome trophy case hidden under a flimsy alias. Thorne leaned back in his chair, the notebook open on the desk in front of him. The unveiling had begun. He was peeling back the layers of a respected public servant to reveal the monster underneath. Thorne knew he was walking a razor's edge. He had a powerful theory, a chain of circumstantial evidence linking the sheriff to the crime, but it was still just a theory. A P.O. box and a 4-year-old doodle were not enough to secure a warrant to search the property of a popular, sitting sheriff. Accusing Owen Blackwood openly would cause a political firestorm, tip him off, and give him time to destroy any evidence that might still exist. His own superiors in Portland and D.C. were already counseling caution, urging him to foster cooperation with local law enforcement, not alienate them with what they called unsubstantiated suspicions. They saw a decorated local hero. Thorne saw a predator who had played them all for fools. He was on his own, and he knew it. Driven by Carter's last written words, something hidden in the pines, Thorne shifted his focus to Blackwood's personal life. He spent hours poring over county property records and tax maps. Publicly, the sheriff owned a comfortable home in town with his wife. But Thorne kept digging, cross-referencing old plat maps with land transfer deeds from decades past. He finally found it, a 40-acre parcel of dense woodland, deep in the national forest, purchased by Blackwood's father over 30 years ago and quietly passed down to Owen. It was officially listed as undeveloped timberland, not a residence, so it never appeared on standard property searches. It was the perfect place to hide something. It was the space between the details that Carter had written about. Thorne knew he couldn't wait for official sanction. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, he drove his rental car down a series of progressively smaller and more rutted roads, following the faded lines on an old surveyor's map. He parked a mile away and continued on foot, a maglite cutting a nervous path through the oppressive darkness of the Oregon woods. The air was cold and smelled of wet cedar and decay. After a 40-minute hike, he saw it, a small, dark shape nestled in a clearing. It was a cabin, rustic and isolated, with no lights on, no signs of life. It was Blackwood's secret place, the something hidden in the pines. He circled the perimeter, his senses on high alert. The place felt wrong, imbued with a profound and chilling silence. He found a window at the back, jimmied the lock with his pocket knife, and slipped inside. The interior was Spartan, obsessively neat. A bed, a table, a wood-burning stove. But it was cold, not with the chill of the night air, but with a sterile, clinical coldness. It felt less like a home, and more like a laboratory. His eyes scanned the room, looking for anything out of place. And then he saw the rug. It was a simple, woven rag rug in the center of the wooden floor, but it was positioned awkwardly, its edges not quite flush with the floorboards. Thorne knelt and lifted the corner. Beneath it, flush with the floor, was a heavy iron ring handle. A cellar door. The air that wafted up from the cellar was stale and metallic, the same faint coppery scent from the footlocker, only stronger here, more pungent. Thorne clicked on his maglite, the beam cutting through the inky blackness as he descended the steep wooden stairs. The cellar was small, its walls made of damp, crumbling stone, but it was the contents that made his blood run cold. This was no wine cellar. It was a tomb, a museum of stolen lives. Along one wall, on a series of rough-hewn shelves, were dozens of personal items, laid out like exhibits. A worn leather backpack, a pair of German hiking boots, a camera with the lens cap still on, a woman's silver locket tarnished with age. Each item was a silent testament to a life cut short, a trophy taken from the victims of Highway 199. He saw a faded University of Colorado sweatshirt and thought of the missing college student. He saw a small, framed photo of a smiling young couple and knew he was looking at the last memento of their lives. Richard Carter's theory hadn't just been right. It had been a terrifying understatement. Blackwood wasn't just a killer. He was a collector. Thorne moved deeper into the room, his light falling on a small, sturdy workbench in the far corner. The surface was littered with wood shavings and carving tools. And next to them, in a neat row, were nearly a dozen small wooden birds, all identical to the one found in Carter's jacket, all in various stages of completion. This was the source. This was the workshop where the killer crafted his macabre signature. A wave of nausea and rage washed over Thorne. He had found it. He had found the heart of the darkness. He took a deep, steadying breath, his training kicking in. He needed to document this, to get out, to bring the full weight of the FBI down on this place. As he reached for the small camera in his pocket, he heard it. The crunch of tires on the gravel drive outside. A car door slamming shut. Footsteps on the cabin's wooden porch. Thorne's heart seized. He was trapped. Blackwood was here. He switched off his light, plunging the cellar into absolute darkness, and drew his service weapon, the soft click of the safety echoing in the suffocating silence. He could hear the sheriff moving around upstairs, the floorboards creaking directly above him. There was no way out. The hunter had just walked into the lion's den. Thorne flattened himself against the cold stone wall, every muscle tensed, his breathing shallow and silent. Above him, Blackwood moved with a casual familiarity, the scrape of a chair, the thud of boots on the floor. Thorne could hear him humming softly, a tuneless, leisurely sound that was more terrifying than any scream. He was a man at ease in his charnel house. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Thorne knew Blackwood would eventually come down to the cellar. It was inevitable. He had to make a choice. Wait in the dark for the attack or force a confrontation on his own terms. He chose the latter. With a sudden explosive movement, he kicked the cellar door open, bursting into the cabin's main room, his weapon leveled. FBI. Don't move, he yelled, his voice cracking the silence like a whip. Sheriff Owen Blackwood was standing by the wood stove, a log in his hand. He didn't flinch. He didn't look surprised or scared. He simply turned his head slowly, a faint, almost curious smile playing on his lips. "Well now," he said, his voice as calm and steady as it had been in his office. "Agent Thorne, I had a feeling you were a man who didn't like to follow the rules." He tossed the log into the stove with a hollow thud. "You should not have come here." The confrontation hung in the air, a standoff between two men in the dim, isolated cabin. There was no panic in Blackwood's eyes, only a cold, clinical assessment. He was calculating, processing, his mind working behind the mask of the friendly neighborhood sheriff. "It's over, Blackwood," Thorne said, his voice tight. "I found it all. The cellar, the trophies, the birds." Blackwood's smile widened slightly. "Rich Carter was a lot like you," he mused, taking a small step to his left, away from the stove and closer to a heavy fireplace poker leaning against the wall. Persistent. Intuitive. He saw that little bird on my dash and just couldn't let it go. Kept asking questions. Poking around. He left me no choice. It was a confession, delivered with the casual air of a man discussing the weather. In that moment, the last vestige of the respected lawman dissolved, revealing the remorseless psychopath beneath. Blackwood moved with a speed that belied his size, lunging for the poker. Thorne fired a warning shot, the roar of the gun deafening in the small space, the bullet splintering the wooden wall just past Blackwood's head. The sheriff didn't even hesitate. He grabbed the heavy iron poker and swung it in a vicious arc, forcing Thorne to dive back, the poker whistling through the air where his head had been and smashing the table to splinters. The fight was on, a brutal, close-quarters struggle for survival in the killer's lair. The cabin became a whirlwind of violence. Thorne, agile and trained, tried to keep his distance, but Blackwood was a force of raw, brutish strength, swinging the heavy poker with terrifying force, smashing furniture, shattering lamps, driving Thorne back toward the cellar steps. The sheriff fought with a cold, focused rage, his face a mask of predatory concentration. He wasn't just trying to disable Thorne, he was trying to shatter him. Thorne fired again, the bullet grazing Blackwood's shoulder, tearing through his shirt. The sheriff grunted in pain, but didn't slow, his eyes burning with a furious intensity. He lunged, and the two men crashed to the floor, wrestling for control of Thorne's weapon. Blackwood was stronger, his thick hands closing around Thorne's wrist, slowly, inexorably twisting the gun away. Thorne slammed his free fist into the man's wounded shoulder, eliciting a roar of pain that gave him a split second of leverage. He broke free, scrambling away as Blackwood rose to his feet, panting, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. "You're just another trophy for my collection, Agent," Blackwood snarled, his voice a low growl. He lunged again, but this time Thorne was ready. He sidestepped and brought the butt of his pistol down hard on the back of Blackwood's knee. The sheriff bellowed as his leg buckled, sending him crashing to the floor. Thorne was on him in an instant, a knee pressed into his back, the muzzle of his gun pressed hard against the base of his skull. The fight was over. The silence that followed was broken only by the ragged sound of their breathing and the soft crackle of the fire in the wood stove. Thorne, his body screaming with pain and adrenaline, finally reached for his radio. His voice strained as he called for backup, giving his location. As they waited in the tense quiet, the sound of distant sirens growing steadily closer, Blackwood began to speak. His confession was not coerced. It was offered, a final, chilling performance. "They were so easy," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "People see the uniform, the badge, and they trust you. They pull right over. I'd tell them there was a problem with their taillight, offer to help. They never suspected a thing, not until it was too late." He talked about Carter. He was smart. He knew. "I met him on that old fire road, told him I had a lead on one of his missing kids. He followed me right here. He was so eager to close the case." A dry, rasping chuckle escaped his lips. "I suppose, in a way, he did." He explained how he had packed Carter's belongings in the footlocker, a memento of his most audacious kill. He'd put it in storage and forgotten about it after setting up his more permanent workshop in the cabin cellar. It was a simple oversight, a loose thread in an otherwise perfect tapestry of murder. The arrival of the FBI task force was a storm of flashing lights and shouted commands. Sheriff Owen Blackwood, the respected community leader, was hauled from his secret cabin, his face impassive, his eyes empty. The subsequent investigation uncovered a graveyard on his property, revealing the remains of Richard Carter and 12 other victims. The case of the ghost of the Oregon highways was finally closed. A week later, Marcus Thorne met Eleanor Carter one last time. He sat with her in her quiet living room and handed her the gleaming gold shield that had been found in the footlocker. "He never gave up, Eleanor," Thorne said, his voice thick with emotion. "He found him. It just took us a little while to catch up." Tears streamed down her face, tears of grief, but also of a profound, long-awaited relief. The final scene of the long drama took place in a small cemetery under a gray Oregon sky. Marcus Thorne stood before the newly placed headstone of Richard M. Carter. Justice had been served. The questions had been answered. The wound that had festered for 4 long years could finally begin to heal. The ghost had been given a name, and his victims, including a brave FBI agent, could finally rest in peace.